hello everybody. Thank you for finding us here again on our Rusagonis Church YouTube channel. You know, out of the endless amount of content that people are able to access online these days, the fact that you've even made the choice to spend a few minutes here with us today, it isn't something that we take for granted. And so we're glad that you're here. And if you've been here before, some of you might already know that we're currently in the middle of a series of messages right now that we've been working our way through that's called 2020, What in the World is Going On? 2020, what in the world is going on? Because unless you've been living under a rock the past 8 months, you'll likely agree with me that in terms of all the great things that we might have thought would happen during this very unique calendar year, now that we're getting near to the end of it, we only have about a month and a half left to go. I think it's pretty safe to say that the year 2020 has largely overpromised and underdelivered. You know, I have a little 4-inch collectible figurine that sits on the corner of my desk in my office, and it's actually a model of my favorite television cartoon of all time, Pinky and the Brain. And if you're familiar with that cartoon, part of the brilliance, and by the way, you should be, it's great. Part of its brilliance is that at the end of every single episode, one of the main characters, Pinky, says to the other main character, Brain, who are both genetically modified lab mice, by the way, Pinky says, "What are we going to do tomorrow night, Brain?" And Brain says, "The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world." And that's the whole series, actually. Every episode is about these two mice trying to take over the world. And in 2020 here, it kind of feels a little bit to me like a Pinky and the Brain episode sometimes. Like it feels like somehow, somewhere, something has just come along that's interrupted everybody's lives on the planet and has been trying to take over the world ever since. And we've even given a name. We call it COVID-19. And because of COVID-19, everybody's wearing masks in public places now, and we've all become experts at knowing what 6 feet distancing looks like, and a lot of us are checking in every day to see how many new COVID cases are being reported in the province, and we've all got hand sanitizer in our homes and in our cars, and if you happen to carry a purse, I know you got some in there too. You know, back in May, before supply was able to catch up with the demand in the early going, Hannah, our daughter, picked up a few little handheld bottles of the stuff, a sanitizer that she spotted for sale somewhere, and she actually gave them to her mother for Mother's Day, which at the time was like, that was the best Mother's Day gift ever. It was like she'd stumbled onto a gold mine or something. Friends, it was March the 11th when the World Health Organization first announced that we had a worldwide pandemic on our hands. And since that time, it really has put its stamp on everything, hasn't it? Even way back then, we might not have fully known it at the time, but 2020, as we know it, didn't stand a chance, really. COVID did that all on its own. And yet, while all of that's been going on, there have been some other things happening in our world too. And some of it is new, and some of it is not so new. Some things have been building up for a while. But against the backdrop of the pandemic we're in, they've really become part of the mainstream conversation. And that's why we just felt it was time to really just talk about these things. And so we put together a 5-part series of talks here, rather than a standalone. And while the big question we've been asking, the umbrella question as I've been calling it, is what in the world is going on? There's a subset of other questions that we've begun asking as well that fit underneath that bigger question that all represent, each one represents an issue that stands out perhaps a little more this year than it would have otherwise. And so on October 25th, we started our series asking the question, is normal ever coming back? Like there seems to be a lot of fear around that whole issue of normalcy and just the interruption in our lives and the way that we interact with one another, the things we're involved with. And so we wanted to talk about that. That's how we started things off. And then a week later, on November the 1st, the next question we were asking was, why can't we all just get along? Clearly, there seems to be increased tensions between different people groups in our world these days. And that's part of the story of 2020 as well. And so we wanted to get a biblical take on that. And then last Sunday, our talk was on Am I Okay?, which represented more of an internal journey for us, related to our mental health and our general well-being. And then this week, we're adding another question to our subset of questions. And I want to just say up front here today that what I mean by this new question we're asking might not be entirely obvious when you first hear it, or you might not understand entirely what it's supposed to be about. But we're going to talk about it for a few minutes, so hopefully it'll make more sense as we go along. But the question we're asking today is simply this: who am I? Who am I? Which, that's a pretty deep sounding question, isn't it? Like the simplest ones typically are. And all the self-declared philosophers in the room will immediately recognize that question as an existential question. In other words, it's a question that goes right to the core of our identity as human beings. Who am I? And again, I know some people might be thinking, I don't get it. Like, what's that have to do with 2020? How does this tie into everything else? What does it have to do with the What in the World series that we're working through? I mean, nothing's really changed on that front for me. I was who I was before 2020 started, and I am who I am now. After 2020 is over, I'll still be the person that I am now. And that's all wonderful. If you're confident in your personal identity, then nobody wants to mess with that, really, especially if it's anchored in the right place. But I want to just also say, respectfully, that not everyone that we meet, and unless you're an extraordinary exception to the rule, not everyone, even in your own circle of friends and family even, carry around with them that same kind of confidence. And again, while it needs to be said that this isn't unique to this particular year, like it's not only something we're seeing in 2020, there might be a sense in which, in a world where life has been largely interrupted and everything else around us has seemingly been thrown up sort of into the air, and that those who already had questions about their personal identity are giving it a little bit more thought these days. Who am I, anyway? It's kind of like the character Alice in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. If you remember the story, early in the book, Alice essentially chases a white rabbit down into a rabbit hole that opens up into a whole other world that she had never experienced in her life. And it's a strange, uncomfortable world for her. It's a world with all these odd characters and underground furnishings, and there are magic foods and drinks and things that make you grow bigger and things that make you grow smaller. I mean, it's a fable, right? So it's full of all kinds of ridiculous, imaginative things. But it's interesting, at one point, while she's at a bit of a crossroads and she's looking at all of it, wondering what to make of it all, and she clearly doesn't feel like she can navigate this different reality very well, it's in that moment that she starts to turn her questioning mind around. And instead of talking about the world that she's in as being changing and indifferent and being different, she says essentially, the world I lived in yesterday is so different now from the world I woke up into today that I wonder if it has less to do with all the moving pieces that are around me and more to do with me. And the quotable line there is her saying to herself, who in the world am I? Ah, that's the great puzzle. And again, in our world, that's the question a lot of people are asking too, even if it's not in so many words, because we might not hear them asking the question, but as we see it being played out in significant life choices, the evidence is there. Like we see it in the workplace, where people are becoming increasingly dissatisfied with their jobs and their careers, and are in some cases leaving stable, healthy work environments without anything else really to move into. We see it in personal relationships. There's a lot of heartache with this one, where couples are choosing, sometimes actually quite amicably, to abandon long-term relationships, not because of abuse or neglect or conflict in the home like we would normally associate with marital dissolution, but more because they just feel like they're in a rut and they need a change. Faith and religion is a big area where we see experimentation these days. People more and more are starting to question what they believe, and if the belief system they have held on to for years is really something that they identify with anymore. And while it's true that some are moving away from faith altogether, the more contemporary trend is to look for spiritual fulfillment in other places and other practices, even crossing boundaries that they never would have thought of crossing before, in order to find something that feels a little more fresh for them. We're going to actually talk about that one a little bit more next week. In our world, gender confusion has become a significant talking point. And more than perhaps at any other time in our history, People are questioning their sexuality and their birth assignment. And of course, that's spilled over into cultural conversations surrounding issues of inclusion and acceptance and that kind of thing, which, regardless of how we might view those things biblically, friends, we can't deny that for those who are asking those questions, and in some cases going through some pretty significant transitions, it represents for them a substantial internal identity conflict. They're struggling with who they are. On another front, I don't know if you've noticed, but more and more people are trying to research their family line than ever before. And it's not because they're interested in history necessarily, because that's what it used to be, right? Like every family had someone who just enjoyed filling in all the blanks on the family tree. It's like a puzzle for them. But in this generation, it's not so much about that as it is that people are just interested in what it tells them about who they are. They want to know who they are. And those DNA kits have become one of the most popular Christmas gifts for the past number of years because of it. And so, like I said, none of this is really confined to this calendar year. It's been building for a while, but it's something that's becoming increasingly transparent, that people are questioning their actual identity as human beings. In a world that is moving so quickly and is constantly changing, and where all this new information is available to us, and again, experimentation is being encouraged and defended and embraced, really the question is being asked now more than it ever has been. Who am I? Who am I? And the passage that I want to share with you here today from the Word of God, that for me at least is one of the more helpful passages in the Bible, and this whole issue of personal identity, is found way back in Exodus 3 of the Old Testament. And it's the burning bush experience that Moses, the early Israelite leader, had while he was tending animals out in a field. It's kind of an unlikely passage for us to be looking at in some ways, but I certainly find it helpful for me. And we're going to read a bit of it together, but in order to appreciate this part of Moses' story, first you have to know a little bit of his early years, because if you think you had a complicated upbringing yourself, it probably isn't as complicated as Moses' upbringing was. And we don't have time to go into all the details of it, but here it is basically kind of in bullet form. Moses was born a Hebrew boy during a period of time when Hebrew families were all living as slaves in the land of Egypt. That was their identity as a people group for a very long time. But worse than that, he was also born at a time when the Egyptian Pharaoh was getting paranoid about a Hebrew uprising. Basically, in his mind, there were getting to be too many of them. And so he issued a brutal order for all newborn male Hebrew babies to be killed or eliminated. Well, that sets off an interesting sequence of events that only God himself could orchestrate in Moses' life. Moses' parents put him in a basket and float him in the river to hide him from the Egyptian Pharaoh. And then the Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter finds him and is immediately overcome with kind of a motherly instinct. And she takes him home, this abandoned child in her eyes, as one of her own. And as a result, Moses ends up being raised as a Hebrew genocide survivor in the place of the one who ordered the genocide, the palace of his home, as a full-fledged member of the royal family of Egypt. That's a pretty intense personal narrative. I told you his life was complicated, right? And you might be thinking, well, yeah, but he ends up being a prince. I mean, if a person's life is going to be complicated, that's a pretty convenient complication, right? Like, that's a good direction. And I'm sure it was for a while, but as he got older, he began to become conflicted about it inside. He felt bad he was living this life of luxury while the rest of the Hebrew people were living as slaves. And during a critical turning point in his life, he makes a regrettable decision. And he comes to the defense of a slave who was being mistreated by an Egyptian slave driver, and he ends up, in a fit of passion, killing the Egyptian and going into running away to save his life. And when we catch up to Moses here now in Exodus 3, the Bible says that many years have passed, and in many ways Moses is still hiding. He's married, he's working, he's tending sheep for his father-in-law, but clearly he's a man that's been haunted by his past, and he's confused about who he's really supposed to be. And if you want to follow along, this is where I'd like to read some of this passage with you, beginning at verse 1. Exodus 3 and verse 1, it says, "One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock far out into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. And if Mount Sinai sounds familiar, it's probably because it's the same mountain where years later God would meet Moses again, give him the 10 commandments for his people. So this would become sort of a special place for God and Moses to meet. Verse 2, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of the bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. And when the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, Moses, Moses. He calls him by name. Here I am, Moses replied, which is all very interesting for someone who'd basically been living somewhere where he felt like nobody knew him or would be able to find him if they did. Do not come any closer, the Lord warned. Take off your sandals, for you're standing on holy ground. Now, keep in mind, Moses hadn't been in touch with God for a while, presumably. He basically checked out of all things that had defined him before. I mean, in his past, during his early years, he really had two groups of people that kind of shaped his identity for him. He had the Egyptians who raised him, and he had the Hebrews who birthed him. But when things went south for him, he ended up running from the one and abandoning the other. Like he didn't know who he was anymore. He didn't identify with anybody. And he probably thought nobody else cared, that he was just a distant memory. A lot of time had passed, remember. And then he's out in the field, and he sees the fire in the bush, and he hears the voice. And listen to the first thing that God says to him. Once they've come together and God identifies who he is, he immediately speaks into Moses' personal identity, and he does it relationally. He says, I am the God of your father, Moses. Remember your father? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, your ancestors. He's basically saying, Moses, I know that you've been away for a while, and I know that life has been challenging for you, and I also know that as a result of those challenges, you really don't know where you fit anymore. And you may not know this, but you're in a crisis of identity. So let me tell you who you are. And let me do it by telling you who I am. I am the God of your father. I'm the God of his father, and all the way back to your ancestors. I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob too. So guess where that leaves you, Moses? You thought you were out of sight, out of mind, way out there in the foothills of the mountain. But I've come to meet you here, and regardless of who else may or may not be here, that makes this holy ground. I mean, this was a moment for Moses. And he knew it too, because the scriptures tell us that when Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then God takes a few minutes to kind of outline for Moses the plan that he has for his life and how he was going to leave the sheep and the fields behind him and go back to Egypt, and how he was going to God was going to raise Moses up as a leader who would speak on God's behalf and free the Hebrew people from slavery after all of those years that they were in bondage. And Moses is listening, but he's still struggling with it. Down in verse 13 now, but Moses protested to God. And look at the words he uses. Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Do you see it? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? It's our existential question coming directly from Moses' mouth. Like, what are you talking to me for, God? I don't even know who I am anymore. You think you have something planned out for me to do, but you got the wrong guy. I was born a Hebrew. I was raised an Egyptian, but now I don't know who I am now. Who am I? And again, God answers him relationally. God answered, I will be with you. And this is your sign that I am the one who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mountain. But Moses protested. If I go to the people of Israel and tell them the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? And God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. And friends, listen, because I know that some people have either struggled with who have either struggled with their personal identity in the past or maybe asking a lot of questions about it right now. They might be thinking, well, how does this all relate to me? I mean, I'm not some Hebrew Egyptian prince that's been sitting out, part of his life out in a field waiting for God not to show up. And that's fair, but there's really only a couple of things that I believe that God wants you to hear from him today. And the first one is this. I'm just going to share a couple of them with you. First one is this. You will never truly know who you are until you truly know who you are to God. That's the big key here, actually. And I don't say that to be trite or to make it seem like it's all that easy to assimilate, especially if you have complexities in your life to work out like Moses did. But one of the things that I have often seen from people when they're going through a crisis of personal identity, whatever shape that takes for you, is that for whatever reason, they either try to push God to the margins or else they try to reshape God into something that fits better with their present way of thinking. And listen, I'm not naive. I understand why that is. It's because someone who's really trying to rethink their understanding of self and go outside of the box with it and the things that they've known, in some cases the structures they've grown up with, they kind of feel like those are outmoded. The idea that a lot of people have is that God is limiting in some way. And we don't want limitations. That's why so many people are making so many wholesale changes in important aspects of their lives. They feel somehow that it's going to free them to be who they are. But there's a verse in Psalm 119:45 where the psalmist says this. It's kind of an important verse in the Bible. He says, I will walk in freedom, for I have devoted myself to your commandments. And all that means is that if you're feeling confused right now, which often feels like bondage, it feels like we're locked into something that we want to be liberated from, the solution to that isn't to push back from God, but to pull him in. Like when Moses heard God speaking from the bushes, he said, I need to get closer. I need to take off my sandals when God tells him to. Why? Because when we're in the presence of God, that's holy space. And once we figure out that he's for us and not against us, and that his way is for our greatest good, then knowing who we are to him will lead us to knowing who we are to us. And so that's the first thing I wanted to share with you. And the second one is this. The experiences of your past are often a pathway to his plan for your future. It took a bit of time for Moses to get there. He spent a lot of time not knowing who he was. So God needed to do some work in him to get him to that place. It takes some time. But once God broke through, he was able to use all those shaping moments in Moses' past to lead him into the things that he wanted him to be. And one of the things I think is interesting is that while Moses was still struggling, God said to him, listen, Moses, I know how this works. Like, I created you. I know what you need. I know it seems like a reach for you. I know all this negative self-talk that you've been doing all these years. I know how much you want to distance yourself from the past and go another way. Let's face it, you've even been distant from me. And so when you finally get the courage, and you'll get there, to go out confident in who you are and knowing that I'm going with you, you'll know that you are who you are and whose you are by the sign that I give you. And the sign I'm going to give you is this. I'm going to bring you right back to this place where we are right now. We read about it in the Word of God. Like, I'm going to bring you back to the base of the mountain, but you won't be alone this time. The next time that you come to the foot of this mountain, out here in Sinai, in the great wilderness here, it's going to be with all the people that I'm asking you to deliver. And you'll worship the Lord together. And as we close, I want to just encourage you to open up your heart to the Lord today. Commit to discovering who you are in God, that he designed you for relationship with him. Step into the life that God is calling you to live. And when you do, just know this. God's pleasure will always follow. God bless you, friends. May you find your identity in him.